Welcome to the Flywheel Economics podcast. Flywheel Economics is a concept that proposes true, sustainable economic growth by viewing economies as ecosystems. I'm your host, Richard O.
And I'm your co-host, Favor Ogbadu. Together, let's explore a more sustainable and powerful way to view innovation, investment, and economic policymaking.
Welcome to today's episode, where we will be looking at affordable and climate smart housing and the ecosystem, the economic ecosystem that surrounds this. And to help us really unpack all of this, we have a special guest host who is Mr. Daniel Simpkins. Welcome, Daniel Simpkins. Would you like to give a brief introduction about yourself?
Hi guys. Yeah, I'm Daniel Simpkins. Thanks for having me. I'm an accidental property developer. I've had a very eclectic career to date, spanning 3 different industries: music, aviation, and now construction. During COVID, the flying industry took a massive change, and it was forced into disarray, and I had to move very quickly into a different industry. And my focus came onto modern methods of construction, and I soon realised my passion for affordable homes. It is a social mobility that we are really needing to focus on. And we really need to start driving change in this arena. And I want to take a deep dive into what can be done about this global problem.
Excellent. And we look forward to taking that journey with you, Dan. And as part of that, I think we've going to look at the different aspects of the housing, affordable housing ecosystem, whether that's the finance that's surrounded, that supports that, whether that's the technologies, as you mentioned earlier, the modern methods, and really try and unpack all of this and understand it, because whether it's in the UK, and there's a very big deficit in affordable housing, or whether it's in developing countries like Nigeria, Kenya, Pakistan, places like that, there's a problem that the ecosystem isn't delivering the quantity of affordable housing and climate smart housing that's required. And I think the more we can understand what's not working in that ecosystem, the more chance we have of being able to support those in government or policymakers or the private sector to try and correct some of that. So, Favour, who's going to help us unpack all of this today?
Yes, our guest for today is Ian Shapiro, who is the Chief Executive of Reall. And Reall, in its own words, is an investor and innovator in climate-smart, affordable housing in urban Africa and Asia. So really excited to hear how his interview went.
Let's go and hear from Ian. Great. So thank you, Ian, for joining us. We're really interested from our perspective here around looking at affordable housing, trying to understand why affordable housing hasn't taken off, at least to the quality affordable housing, to the extent that we ideally would want, both in countries like the UK, but also in emerging markets. And we're really interested to get under the skin of that and understand things. Ian, would you mind introducing yourself and what Reall does?
Sure, Richard, Favour, Dan. Yeah, great to be here. So I'm Ian Shapiro. I'm the Chief Executive at Reall, and what we do is we do 2 things. We're really driven by creating green affordable housing markets at a mass scale. So looking at how low-income people can get into green affordable homes, so we can go into that, and we do that in 2 ways. One, by investing in demonstration housing. So we actually do a whole range of different styles, interventions, and investments to build homes. So we know what the reality of that supply chain looks like. And then we work on the kind of policy influence, change, advocacy dimension, because the scale of the challenge, as I'm sure we'll get into in this conversation is well beyond an organisation like us. So we see our role here is to be catalytic and accelerating change rather than trying to monopolise or control the whole marketplace.
Thank you, Ian. Over to you, Favour.
All right. Thank you very much again, Ian. So I think you've talked a bit about Reall, but could you just tell us what motivated you to work specifically on affordable and climate smart housing in emerging markets?
So I think, Favour, one of the issues in front of us is very unusual, and I'd love to hear from the three of you or from anyone else who's listening in due course. To think about an issue that can actually, in the palm of its hand, address probably three of the big global demographic shifts that we face as a society now. So if we think about the big challenges in front of us, so we've got urbanization happening. So that's about 2.5 billion more people in Africa and Asia's cities within a generation. We've obviously got the climate challenge. So we know that if we've got any chance of staying within 2 degrees of temperature rise, we've got to get our buildings built in a much smarter, greener way. So, 37% of greenhouse gases come from the built environment, and 70% of buildings in Africa and Asia haven't been built yet. So if you think about all of that shift, what's happening there, those are, if we don't get that right in housing, we have no chance globally of staying within 2 degrees. And then, of course, there's a poverty and inequality dimension where if we want inclusive, secure, safe, prosperous societies where people have the opportunity to excel and to express themselves, we've got to deal with their ability to have a safe roof over their heads, access to education, clean energy, and credible societies and communities. So those three pieces, the urbanization challenge, the climate challenge, and the inequality challenge, actually green affordable housing is a doorway to all of them, and it's the opportunity to give us a green planet, a prosperous planet, and a future for all of those people who presently are excluded from that opportunity. And so it's incredibly rare to have something in the palm of your hand, that experience that you feel can really make a huge change to potentially billions of people's lives and the planet as a whole. And really, that's a rare privilege to work on that topic, and to feel that there's a real opportunity here to shape what happens in terms of the arc of history of the next coming hundreds of years.
Ian, that's really clear. I guess the next question on this is, what actually is affordable housing? What does that mean? Because it sounds almost quite like a subjective thing. What's affordable housing to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right, Richard. I mean, it's a contentious topic. I think Dan probably knows much more about the UK housing market than I do. But my summary position of the UK affordable means 20% below market rate. So if you're in an expensive part of the UK, 20% below market rate just still is extortionately expensive and unaccessible to the vast majority of people. I work much more. I do some international work and some UK work, but much more in the Africa and Asia market. And I like to think about it in kind of ticket prices. So really, what are we talking about in terms of the cost of the home? And when I mean the cost of the home, I mean that inclusive of the land, access to energy, credible linkages to local schools and hospitals and so on. So consider that as the home itself is a piece of that. At the moment, our portfolio is, it varies, but let's say around $12,000 for a credible, high quality green home. We do stretch, so lots of our homes are now sort of $15,000 to $25,000. It does depend on markets, and we believe in mixed income use. So that's different prices at different points within a community, so you get a good integrated solution. But I like to think of affordability on a price basis. Now, to some listeners, the idea of a $15,000 home sounds like you must be mad. That's what I just bought a couple of TVs for that. But for other people, $15,000 seems an absolute exorbitant sum that they can't reach. So affordability is very much in the ear of the listener. To use your point, Richard, about it's a contested term. But I think what we're talking about here is mass market use. So we're not talking about at the elite level, and we're not talking about people who are homeless or who are living under bridges. Those are absolutely vital, that there are services for people in those circumstances, but we think that's a welfare solution. What we're talking about is a mass market solution. So that's people who have some kind of employment, formal, informal, regular or irregular, but actually have a way of being able to pay for themselves. And the key point I'd make on this is that there are, of the kind of, estimates vary, but let's say the 1.5 billion people with insecure shelter at the moment, the vast majority of them have an income. So the vast majority of them are paying rent to someone. So they are not sleeping on the streets. They are paying someone rent. So therefore they have an income source which allows them to pay for their housing. So what we're interested in doing is changing the market system so that that expenditure they're making benefits them in the long run. And I'm sure we can get into more of what that means.
Thank you very much, Ian. So before we go to Dan next, I just wanted to ask, what does the green aspect of things mean? I know on one hand it sounds like a really simple definition, but when we say climate smart housing, what does it mean?
So again, absolutely right. I mean, contested. There are different metrics. So again, I'm sure Dan can talk to us about the UK, where we've got BREEAM and other kind of international standards. What we do, the most utilized source is what we call is the IFC, so part of the World Bank Group's EDGE standard certification. So every home we invest in has international green standards. There are a number of levels within EDGE, so you can be EDGE Basic, which is something like 40% less embodied energy compared to a traditional home. You can have EDGE Advanced, and you can have a net zero home. And again, we can talk about different elements of that within our portfolio. But for the simplistic short answer is everything we invest in must be EDGE certified, which means it must have an internationally recognized green certification. Otherwise, we won't invest in it.
Thanks, Ian. I just wanted to touch on demographics. You've talked about investing in housing for the people, but it sounds like the demographic is quite broad. Is there a specific group you're targeting, or is it open to anyone that meets the criteria?
So, well, I mean, firstly, we should look at some of the kind of shifts of what happened, Dan. So I will come to your question specifically, but just look at the shifts. 100 years ago, we had a global population of 2 billion people, and 20% of them lived in urban areas. And in 100 years, we've now got 8 billion people and 55% of them in urban areas. And within a generation, so by 2050, we're going to have 10 billion people and 70% of them in urban areas. So not only have we got a shift in population, we've got a shift in where that population lives. And then again, you'll see the same thing if you look at what's happening in, say, Europe, where the population is decreasing and buildings are already built. So in the environment you work in, the green agenda and the targeting on affordability, it's much more around retrofit because the buildings exist. Whereas if you look at emerging markets, where you're talking about 2.5 billion more people in Africa and Asia cities, and 70% of buildings not built, you're much more talking about new build. So, and you're talking much more about urban centres where that growth is going to happen because that urbanization rate is accelerating. So why am I using that as the backdrop to your question about who you're targeting? So when I say who we're targeting, so we are targeting primarily between the 20th percentile, so not the poorest people in a country, because we think that you need a subsidized proposition for that. You need some kind of welfare system. We don't think it's commercially viable, but we think above about the 20th percentile it is, and then that up to the 70th percentile. That is again because we think if you're above the 70th percentile of income, so you're in the top 30% of earners in a country, you've got other solutions. There are other ways you can deal with this where you don't need an intervention such as what we would bring in. So we're looking at people who live in urban areas because that's where a lot of the growth's happening, and we're looking at that mass market solution. So not people who are maybe struggling for employment or struggling for a job, and not those who are more formal sector workers in pretty formally employed jobs, which is really the top sort of 30% of the economy.
My other question is, you mentioned both renting and home ownership. Is the goal to help people buy homes or provide properties at subsidised affordable rent? Or is there space for both?
Yeah, so I think there's something super fascinating about the mix of rental to ownership propositions, and there's huge cultural variation. So I'm talking to you from the UK, where we are obsessed by home ownership, and I think we've got about 78% of the UK as homeowners. I think if you go to, say, Nigeria or Kenya, you'll see it's well below 10%. So, it completely varies in terms of that. So there's clearly a space for rental to be a credible proposition. I think what we're interested in when we offer rental properties is that you've got a greenhouse, as in it's environmentally sound and sustainable, it's well built, it's well managed, you've got access to credible services, and you're not being exploited. So what I mean by that is that at the moment there are a bunch of pretty unscrupulous slumlords, as they're called, people who manage large numbers of properties in informal settlements in emerging markets, who are taking huge amounts of money on prime real estate, but offering a pretty non-existent, appalling service. So no running water, no windows, no access to services. And what we're saying is that for the same amount that a family might pay, so if you look at Gordon and Gladys, two people I know in Kenya, who were paying to live in a slum called Mukuru in Nairobi, for the same amount they were paying their slumlord to have a one-bedroom home in a slum with no running water, no windows, no electricity. They could use the same amount of money per month to move into a two-bedroom house with running water, clean energy, and pay that off in 8 years to own that home themselves, which mean that they then have access to credit, bank accounts, as well as all those services, and it is at exactly the same cost. I mean, the shillings moved around in that time period, but if you looked at the equivalent rate, we're saying it is a transferable fee. So these are people who'd never, Gordon and Gladys had never missed a rental payment in 25 years, but they'd never had anyone who would take the risk on them, the risk on trusting them to repay, because neither of them have formal sector jobs. One was Gordon's a welder, Gladys sells donuts in the local market. So they had an income, but no one would ever take the risk that they would pay, despite them having a 25-year successful track record of doing it. So what I mean is that a lot of what we do is that kind of opportunity, showing that people who are renting can be owners. But the other thing I think implied in your question, Dan, as well, is that there is obviously a space for renting, because there are times people don't want to own their own home, or they're moving somewhere for a temporary reason, studying, working, job, family relocation. And so there needs to be a credible rental proposition. I guess what we're saying then is that the quality of the home needs to be the same standard, whether you're owning it or renting it. And therefore, there's not an exploitative slumlord acting in the middle, making lots of good money on offering you a very unhealthy living opportunity.
So sort of building on from the definitions, Ian, do you see a lot of variation across countries, Ian, about what these definitions of affordable housing might be, or what green housing may be? I mean, you mentioned the EDGE criteria earlier, but is there a lot of variation, or is it pretty universal between Pakistan, Kenya, Nigeria?
Yeah, so there is variation on what constitutes affordable, and of course, in any of these situations, we have relative assessments as well ourselves, as well as absolute assessments, and there's also cultural norms or expectations of markets. So the homes that we build in Pakistan don't look anything like the homes that we build in Nigeria. So they might meet the same kind of criteria of, say, 49% less water or 60% less embodied energy. They might be comparable, but the actual design of the home will vary. So affordability, design, all of that, absolutely. You know, and we've made mistakes when we've done this ourselves. I don't want to suggest that we always get this right. You know, we designed a brilliant, environmentally sound, earthquake resistant set of homes in Nepal. We were super excited and very pleased with ourselves. But then found that the market had no appetite for them whatsoever. Just the actual design of the earthquake resistant just didn't land with the market. The market was like, no, that's not the kind of home that I want, and therefore you've got to learn from that. So there absolutely are differences. Expectations, you know, if you look at say South Asia, you'll see that mid and high rise is a much more familiar concept. So, you know, that's whether you're going up to 5 stories or 25 stories. Whereas if you're in sub-Saharan Africa, and I'm of course mass generalizing across large parts of the world, but you know, there's a much more of an appetite and an expectation that if you have a home, you should have your own garden. That should be part of it, often single story, perhaps 2 stories, but that you have your own front garden. Now, these things aren't right or wrong. They're just different expectations, partly because of how communities have evolved. And of course, as we think about expanding populations, we also need to recognize that some of those expectations need to shift a bit as well. And we see that as part of our job to be part of that conversation. You know, sub-Saharan Africa used to be 100 years ago was 7% of the global population. Within a generation, it's going to be 25% of the global population. So what you could do for your housing stock 100 years ago is not what you can do with your housing stock for today or preparing for tomorrow. So there are obviously differences in that regard that vary across. I mean, you know, Richard, you mentioned Pakistan and Nigeria as examples, but yeah, exactly. You need to respond to those local market conditions.
Okay, over to you, Faber, for the next question.
Okay. Ian, why is there such a gap in quality affordable housing, and what do you feel are the most significant barriers to affordable housing development?
So I think there's a variety of factors at play here. I mean, part of this is that it depends what your incentives are to engage. So we believe in markets as a solution. That's the way to make this work. The scale of the challenges beyond. I think there's a role for the public sector for setting the right incentives, but we shouldn't be expected to deliver the scale of housing that's needed. So I think if you're a developer in a Nigerian or Pakistani or Kenyan market, you know, countries we've been using in this conversation as an example, you know, if you're able to build, let's say, $100,000 home, you could probably make something like a 40% margin on that. And obviously, if you can find someone to buy that home, a 40% margin on a $100,000 home is pretty attractive. So the question then is, though, that market gets saturated, and I think you'll find that in lots of the urban centres in the countries that we're talking about, even in some of the second and third tier cities, you start to see at that top end that the market's saturated. The question then is, so what kind of margins are available if you're making a $15,000 home? And as we were discussing earlier, that you're not going to get a 40% margin on a $15,000 home. You might make a 10% margin on a $15,000 home. So then it becomes a volume play rather than a margin play. And the question is, where are the developers, or where are the incentives for the developers to be building at scale the kind of $15,000 home, the $20,000 homes that we're talking about? And I think for that to take place, really, you need to make sure that you're incentivized to do it. So there's a level of risk. So we're trying to deal with some of that information asymmetry. So that idea that if you're an informal sector worker, that you're a higher risk person to lend money to than perhaps you are if you're a formal sector worker. And how do we help deal with some of those challenges? So if we look at Kenya, you know, a 55 million population, there's less than 30,000 mortgages in Kenya. So that means you've got to be, you know, the elite of the elite of the elite to access a mortgage in Kenya. And so really, those are some of the areas that we need to get right. We need to increase the supply. So that's encouraging developers to move down market and offer the right kind of opportunity. So that could be insisting that proportions of homes that for every license you're providing, that proportions need to be affordable. And it means working on the kind of offtake proposition. So particularly we look at mortgages, but there are other forms of financial product. How do we help banks and others create the right kind of structuring which allows them to give small scale loans and de-risk those people who are informal sector workers to access credit? And I'm happy to go into some of the solutions there are in that space, but I think those are two of the big pieces that we really need to change. We need to change the direction of that conversation if we're gonna change this housing issue at scale.
Thank you, Ian. I was really struck by what you said about it being a volume play rather than a margin play for affordable housing. Dan, that sounds a little bit similar to the UK in affordable housing. Is that your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. The main reason we see affordable housing being built in the UK is that developers are often only granted planning permission if they include a certain number of affordable homes. The real issue lies in the lack of incentives and forward-thinking policies. Property developers are driven by high margins. So if we want to make a real impact, we need to start thinking about scale and volume as part of the solution. Ian, would you say in emerging markets this is similar?
So there's definitely the appetite for developers is to stay at the high end of the market. You know, it's a surprisingly risk averse business. And I think this is where kind of some of the incentives that we can set out and some of the demonstration effects to show that people on low incomes will repay, that we need to do that. And I think there's a clever bit of smart money that can be invested either by impact investors or public sector money to do some of the kind of guaranteeing of down payments, because I think that can bring some of the developers down market for exactly the reasons that you're talking about, Dan, that if you can avoid that, you would. But of course, I think really there's a huge scale play here, as Richard, you were saying, that volume proposition. You know, if you've got, you know, Nigeria, we were talking about earlier, you know, there's 200 million people in Nigeria today. There'll be 400 million by 2050. I mean, that's an enormous number of homes. So enormous number of people and a market there to play with. So how do we incentivize developers to get into that area where they recognize that their margins are tighter, but there is a credible margin because it's a cumulative margin. And if you're talking about, instead of building, you know, 5, 10, 50, 100 homes, you're dealing in thousands of homes, then really there is good investment to be made here, and there is good opportunity for developers.
If we're talking about a volume play, Ian, does that necessitate that we're talking about prefabricated housing and housing which is developed in factories and then assembled on site? Or can that volume play be also from more, I guess, conventional methods of construction?
So I don't think it's an either or, Richard. I mean, there's obviously an enormous amount of building that is going to take place. I think what we need to do, I mean, I want to kind of unpack a little bit what you mean by traditional, but let me make some assumptions on what you mean, and you can correct me if I'm misinterpreting. But I think that there's a role for prefabrication, modern methods of construction, partial offsite production. Absolutely, there is, and there's a whole range of really interesting interventions we've got. So we've looked at things like shared utility walls, which are prefabricated offsite, which can just come in and be slotted in, prefabricated whole homes, as well as more, in quotes, traditional home styles. I think the key thing we want to do is be developing a local market so that we're using local resources, local materials, creating local jobs, reducing imports. That's obviously absolutely crucial in terms of how this plays, because, you know, we are trying to make sure we're minimizing the carbon footprint of an enormous untapped industry and an untapped sector here. So So there's a role for offsite prefabrication, absolutely, but doesn't exclusively need to be that. We've got homes in our portfolio that don't use any kind of offsite prefabrication, use purely traditional methods, but can still be done in much smarter green ways using local materials and still hit those price points and hit those green international standards.
Thanks again, Ian. So my next question is, are the barriers to affordable housing universal? And what I mean by that is, in the different countries you have had the opportunity to work in, can you see commonalities in the kind of barriers that exist to affordable housing?
So there are certainly commonalities. There's a lot of rhyming, if we can use that reference across. So the absence of credit, the access to mortgages or other types of finance for people on low incomes, which is due to that risk issue. And we should talk a bit about some of our investment in AI supported technology to show the credit worthiness of people on low incomes. But let's come back to that. But that credit worthiness is proving that absolutely across sectors, countries, and environments. The desire for developers, as Dan was talking about, to stay at the highest price point they can get, because that's where their margins are biggest. So trying to incentivize them to come down. And then some of the issues about where the investment capital can come from. So what we're interested in is showing that you can redirect existing capital flows. This doesn't need fresh capital. It just needs slightly longer term capital. So things like pension funds, which are often touted as a credible, who need a fairly steady return over a long term basis. Actually, green affordable housing can be a really healthy answer to that in terms of providing a solution for local capital markets. So international financing brings another set of dimensions when you're getting into foreign exchange risk and capital flight issues. But really, what we're talking about is how do you develop economies in emerging markets, and that means local production, local skill sets, making sure you've got the trained personnel, the raw materials, and the right kind of investment incentives.
That was great, Ian. Thank you very much. So I wanted to ask now, that how is climate change impacting on design? Earlier you mentioned things like earthquakes and the design that goes around it. But when it comes to other natural disasters in affordable housing, is space being made for other designs like that cover other natural disasters like hurricanes and floods and the rest?
Yeah. So I mean, the climate dimension is absolutely crucial, because there is, of course, a risk that we fix, in quote marks, the housing crisis globally. And we do that by pouring huge amounts of concrete and other heavily embodied energy materials into the ground, and we fix one problem and exacerbate another one. So we've got to make sure that we do this together. There are lots of really interesting ways of doing this, and we were talking earlier about prefabrication, which can really help. But there's also about local design. So, for example, in Pakistan, we've got an amazing wind capture design that is integrated, that offers 10-degree cooling inside compared to outside, just with a smart bit of a wind capture design for the home. So it's a very, very low cost, doesn't require any maintenance and so forth. Now, that's a brilliant solution, and of course, it only works where there's sufficient wind. So that isn't going to be an answer everywhere. We know 95 of the top 100 most exposed cities for climate are in emerging markets. So how we get these designs right for changing climatic conditions is vital. Often there are really smart low-cost solutions. So what we've done in Mozambique, in Beira, the second city, which is in a hurricane cyclone path, really low-cost hooks introduced in our designs to the roof meant that when Cyclone Idai burst through the city and decimated over 95% of buildings, our low-cost green affordable homes stood up well. And really, that was just to do with some really smart, simple design techniques like U-shaped hooks on the roofs, which sounds crazy, but really can make an enormous difference. So design absolutely matters, and you've got to get it right for the kind of conditions that you're operating in. Clearly, we also want to make sure that we incentivize it in the right way. So let me give you a perverse incentive, which runs counter to what we're trying to do. So, for example, when we're using our international climate accreditation, you need to be able to account for every item that you're putting into the home, so you can capture its embodied energy and accumulate that number. So we've had concerns with some of our local developers who say they have to, for example, import taps from China, because that can then show that those taps can then be credited in terms of their carbon footprint, as opposed to just going to the local market and using the local informal sector workers to provide the taps, which would be a much lower carbon footprint, much better for local jobs and economies and so on. So that there are tweaks to the systems that we need, such as how do you demonstrate and incentivize local production for jobs and for climate reasons. And absolutely, they need to be adapting to those local conditions, and we know those local conditions are changing, and they're changing fast. There's heat particularly, but also increased rainfall. So how do you design in a way that factors that in for the long term? Absolutely essential and possible to do. The answer clearly is not, putting air conditioning units and everything. I mean, move aside from the cost implications of that, the climate implications of that would be disastrous. So we just got to make sure that we're designing in smart passive cooling techniques, such as that wind capture idea I was talking about from Pakistan earlier.
That's really interesting. There's a couple of things that I want to come back to with you later. One is on the AI-supported technology you mentioned previously around creditworthiness. That sounds really fascinating. The second is what you just mentioned now around the sort of perverse incentives from the regulation around this and some of the unintended consequences that's having. Maybe just on that, to what extent are those that regulate these green credentials for housing having conversations with organizations such as your own, developers about some of these perverse incentives that are happening because of their criteria? Is that kind of dialogue happening, or not as much as it should?
No, I think in fairness, so the World Bank Group, who we work with closely on this, are very open and receptive and constantly modifying and updating. So I think, there's a lot of dialogue between us. I mean, there aren't enormous numbers of people in this area, and we'd welcome lots of others. And I hope anyone who's listening who wants to get in touch and has got ideas to share, we'd love to hear from you and learn from you. But I would say that there is an openness to that. Of course, then there are structural challenges. So take that local taps issue, which does create unintended consequences. It's clear that we can all sit here and discuss it and describe it, and it's really clear that that's a flaw in the system. But then it isn't obvious to think, how do you get the kind of regulatory environment? How do you get the inspection done right? But there are ways of doing it. You need to, make sure you're working with credible developers who you can look at various aspects of what they produce, giving you confidence. Then you can do spot checks or occasional tests on individual items, such as, I'm using taps as my example here. So there is a way of getting around it. And I think that as each iteration comes, we can make more progress on that.
Thanks, Ian. So I work mostly at the moment on small states. I've been working a lot with the Caribbean region, Pacific Islands. One of the learnings that came out from some of the big hurricanes that hit the Caribbean region, particularly with Dominica, with the big hurricane they had a few years back, was reflections around the housing that stood up to the hurricane and the housing which got flattened by this, and also the smartness in that design. And one of the commentaries I've heard around this has been around the more traditional housing stock, which perhaps was very old housing stock, but was built with much more sensitivity to the environment it was in. So the example being the sort of more French design type houses that are on the island, where they were taking recognition of where the trade winds would come in, and they would have window shutters that would allow the trade winds to sort of blow through the house and cool the house in a similar way to what you described the Pakistan example, with allowing that sort of 10-degree cooling. That they would do that with that in mind. That they would also build these buildings in a way where there wasn't as much glass in the design, so that it wouldn't smash as much and cause so much damage and injury. That, you know, the shutter design was there for that as well. There was a lot of tailoring to the conditions and the environments. It sounds like you're trying to do that with your affordable housing as well. To what extent do you think this is possible when we're trying to do, you know, large volumes of houses? Is it possible to tailor it to the environment in the same way as when you're doing, you know, a few houses here and there? When, you know, if you're going to scale and you're going for affordability, can you make those adaptations that really make a difference, both in terms of climate change, in terms of resilience, and all the rest?
So, Richard, I mean, you're talking about a part of the world that you know much better than I do. So I'd love to learn more. I mean, I'm interested in those houses in Dominica. I mean, how long they've been using that style. I mean, I wonder whether if you go back 100 years, 200 years, and 300 years, that you'll see those styles will have evolved. And I mean, Dominica is not an area that, or a region that I know. So I defer to you, but taste change, taste evolve. You know, we were talking about mid-rise and high-rise buildings earlier. You know, they didn't used to be the norm in places. So I think what is essential is being sensitive to local demand, appetite, local materials, adapting to that from a design point of view and from a style point of view, but also recognizing that part of our responsibility is to evolve what is needed for a healthy, prosperous, inclusive planet for all of us. So as a simple example, it is not realistic that we build the homes for over 1 billion more urban dwellers in African cities in the next 20 or so years, and that they all have a single-story home with a front garden. I mean, so that would be culturally desirable for lots of people, but it's just not practical. That is not a way that you can deal with what is almost a doubling of sub-Saharan Africa's population, you know, in urban areas, from about 1.3 billion to about 2.5 within a generation. So there do need to be shifts, but those shifts do need to be culturally sensitive and appropriate, and you need to be done in such a way that these are aspirational places to live. That they're places that any of us, the four of us on this call, would be happy to live in these homes. That we're not talking about creating vertical slums or creating you know, prison cell type accommodation. That doesn't work for anyone. It doesn't have any long-term benefit. So these need to be aspirational, desirable places to live. Yes, then we need to adapt to those conditions. And your example about how much glass you might have in a home is a perfect example of where you might do that.
So, Ian, I'm going to come back to you in a second on some of the more sort of your sort of proudest successes with Reall and what you've been able to achieve in the area. But before I do, you mentioned earlier, and maybe this is an opportunity also to talk about the AI supported technology, but how do we get more finance and investment to help scale up affordable housing? What's the key in all of this? You mentioned the mortgage market earlier, and how in Kenya it was it 30,000 mortgages in total? Is that correct? You know, how do we get more finance, whether that's for the developer, whether that's for those purchasing the properties? How do we really unlock that? What do you see as the key for that?
So I think we definitely need to incentivize or encourage financial flows into this space. So if you take, you know, Kenya as our example, exactly right. There's less than 30,000 mortgages, population of 55 million people. So I'm in the UK. Probably if I stood on my roof, I could probably see 30,000 mortgages outside, you know, just in my eye line in the UK. And yet a country of a similar size, Kenya, pretty sophisticated capital markets, doesn't have that. Now that's so I think there are ways of incentivizing those flows. So I mean, I don't think probably your listenership are too keen to get into kind of treasury bills and 10-year bonds and how all that works. But there are, challenges here where, the government of Kenya offer you, I think it's 16 or just over 16% at the moment if you just put your money in a treasury bill. So that means if you're going to invest in anything else, such as green affordable homes, you've got to be confident of getting a return above 16%, because otherwise just put it into a treasury bill and you're guaranteed that return. Then if you're looking for returns above 16%, then effectively you're going to pass on a lot of those costs to the end user. So if you're a the welder and the partner who is selling food in the local market, if you're talking about having to meet interest rates of above 16% to ensure that the developer gets a return as well, these become really, really challenging numbers. So there are issues here that we can create some of the incentives to de-risk people, the end user, so show that they are credit worthy. And I can just say a word on that on the machine-based learning that we use, the AI techniques that we're investing into to trial that, but also how you structure that investment for capital. So you encourage banks to put a proportion of their funding into affordable homes, or you allow different types of, for every dollar you invest in a treasury bill, you have to put something else into a productive sector as well. There are a range of ways that you can set you can redirect capital flows into more productive spaces. And I think, Richard, with your background as well, you'll know more and understand more about this than I do. But there are structural ways that you can offer that in terms of the capital markets and how you structure some of your capital stack. And just a quick sentence on the artificial intelligence. What we do is we work with a partner called Tintellect in India. We've worked with 14,000 people in India, where they use an AI-based app to explore where their assets are. So what they're doing as an informal sector worker, what kind of resources they've got, using video imagery as well to kind of calculate that and use those figures to then into a bank's system, so the bank can then run a different type of credit assessment against those individuals, which isn't based purely on the traditional show me your employment slip for the last 6 months, but takes a much more organic view of how their finances and their assets work. And then that allows the bank to be prepared to take the risk to offer credit to an informal sector worker. And we've seen incredibly high repayment rates. It's been very successful. We're in the midst of a couple of transactions taking that technique to Kenya as well, because we think this kind of AI-enabled risk assessment for informal workers could be a real game changer for demonstrating that banks and others can take a risk on people on low incomes.
Yeah, that sounds like such an important stepping stone in terms of being able to get that access to finance for those who haven't built up that kind of credit history through more conventional ways. Ian, what are you most proud of in terms of what Reall have achieved so far in affordable housing? What are those success stories that you look back really fondly on?
I mean, Richard, there are loads, and it's such an inspiring area to work. We've been part of building over 60,000 homes. We've won net zero awards. We've talked about some of the new technologies and techniques we've introduced them, whether that's in the Philippines or Pakistan or India, or Ghana, Nigeria. Some of the first internationally accredited green accreditation affordable homes in Pakistan, in Ghana, in Nigeria have all been Reall funded innovations to show demonstrations to the market that it can work. So there's loads to be excited about and energized by. I think if I give myself a slightly harder time than that, I ask myself, why are we such a sort of market leader in this space? And I ask myself why the market's so small. And really, we want to be crowding in others' ideas, investment funds, suggestions, people who want to pioneer into this incredible opportunity of having a pretty untouched virgin $17 trillion green asset class that can work low-income people. It's an incredible opportunity. And I think if I'm frustrated with myself and us, is why haven't we been more successful in crowding others in? Because this is a huge opportunity. But also, if we don't get it right, and start shifting that curve in the next few years, then from a planetary point of view, we're all in trouble wherever we live. And really, that's really the challenge for me and for us and for anyone listening who wants to be part of that. We'd love to take ideas, advice, and suggestions from others and work with others to really shift the dial on this.
And what would you say, Ian, was you've obviously also been working in the policy space around this as well as the practical aspects of things. What would you say was the single change to the housing ecosystem, affordable housing ecosystem, which would make the biggest impact on affordable housing?
So I think there is there's both supply and demand side challenges. So on the supply side, it's creating the right incentives. So, we've worked on things like changing minimum plot sizes in Mozambique, for example, because otherwise you just couldn't build any affordable homes because the plot sizes were too big. In Kenya, working with the government to change what the incentives are to ensure that there's a higher proportion of affordable homes. So there's a supply side challenge working there. Where we create the right incentives for really rapidly changing city environments. And on the demand side, I do think it's about this access to credit and how do we help people who are on low incomes but do have an income to get into the formal banking system, to give them that opportunity to access credit. That really can be an absolute game changer for them in terms of accessing credit, investing in long-term opportunities, and giving them the opportunity to sometimes own their own home, sometimes rent in a safe, environmentally sound way, but really showing that they are credit worthy. That's the big change that we need on the demand side.
Well, look, Ian, it's been really inspiring to hear what you've done and what you've been working on, which for all the reasons you've set out is so important, both now and increasingly so in the future with the urbanization, climate change, all the rest of these factors, the equity considerations as well. Thank you so much for taking time to speak with us, and I hope we can continue the conversation in one form or another as we delve into more depth on various aspects of affordable housing in the future. So thank you very much.
No, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Favour, and Daniel, and I hope that we can absolutely be part of any conversation and get others involved in it. So we're grateful for everything you're doing.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I just wanted to add, it's really inspiring to hear how you're aiming to open things up through open sourcing rather than monopolizing the space. Encouraging developers, investors, and key organizations to collaborate will be critical in tackling this global housing crisis. The word incentive has come up a lot in this podcast, and it's clear that this is something that we need to explore more deeply moving forward. Would you agree?
Absolutely, we do. We know that the demand is there, the appetite is huge. We just need to align those incentives in such a way that it can work for all parties.
Well, that was absolutely fascinating. We asked Ian about his, the achievement he was most proud of. He mentioned the 60,000 new affordable homes. Just to put that in context as to what kind of achievement that is, if you look back at 2022, 2023 in the UK, the entire stock of new affordable homes in the UK was 63,605 affordable homes. That's for the whole country. And Ian's company has been able to finance or fund 60,000 affordable homes around the world. And that's just one company. So something that he can be really proud of, that Reall can be really proud of, but then also I think something which shows us the scale of the challenge as well, because we know that's a small amount against the global need and demand there is out there. But well done to Ian for making a real stab at it. I'm going to go to Dan and Favour to get your thoughts on what really struck you from that conversation with Ian. Over to you first, Dan.
Well, Ian touched on several key aspects of the affordable housing market, and we learned that creating affordable homes isn't just about building structures, is it? It's about meeting people's aspirations for how they want to live, whilst at the same time we're faced with the challenge of fitting more people into increasingly dense urban landscapes. So Ian also highlighted the importance of financing investment and how critical it is to incentivize developers to actively engage in building affordable homes. As we discussed, the affordable housing landscape is complex and is fraught with challenges. But over the next few episodes, I really hope that we're going to be able to dive deeper into these topics and bring together our thoughts on how we can find a way forward for more accessible, affordable homes for everybody.
Yeah. Favour, what struck you from the conversation with Ian?
Yeah, so I want to start from this article that I saw recently. Basically, it was talking about housing data gathered by Gallup Analytics, and it was saying that dissatisfaction with housing has hit a record high across rich countries, that is OECD countries, and it's about 60%. And researchers were saying that basically, the reason is because not enough houses have been built. And so I was just thinking to myself that if we're seeing this kind of numbers in richer countries, what is the hope for emerging markets? And for me, I'll say my answer has to be the hope is companies like Reall. And they have done so much. They are doing so much. 60,000 houses, that's a lot. But just like Ian was saying, there's still a lot of things that still needs to be done. And just like we've pointed out time and time in this podcast, collaboration is key. I don't think there's any case study that we have gone through and we haven't highlighted the power of collaboration. We haven't highlighted how people had to come together. So Reall on its own, they have their partners, but they can only do so much. And so to me, that's the key thing I took away from the fact that, yes, affordable housing has gone further, but we can see the statistics, the data doesn't lie. They're telling a story here that there's still an issue. And I guess I just want to join Ian in his call for like more support and more people joining this fight, basically to bring affordable housing in emerging markets and all around the world, basically.
Yeah, I agree, Favour. I think finally, if I'm to think of my own reflection on all of this, and I put my, my economist hat back on, it struck me when Ian referenced sort of interest rates starting at 16%, which was just for government, for a government bond, and that being the sort of the starting point for where you start looking at finance for housing, meaning it has to be in excess of that. And that's not just true for housing, that's true for many other sectors in economies in developing countries where they need investment. And it's a real barrier. And to some extent, countries often look to subsidize interest rates and, find ways, but it's not always the most sustainable way of doing things. And you reach this fundamental problem in many emerging markets, which is just the interest rates at the level they're at prohibit that investment from happening. And the only way you can tackle that is if you can reduce government borrowing in the market. If you're able to perhaps broaden the tax base, you're able to really find other ways of governments financing their expenditure so that it takes the pressure off those interest rates and those interest rates can come down. And then you start making projects feasible. So there's something on the macro economy there, I think, is part of that ecosystem, which isn't exclusive to affordable housing, which really needs to be addressed. But look, this is going to be a fascinating journey. Ian has helped us touch on many aspects of the ecosystem around affordable housing, both in developing countries, emerging markets, but also helping us to think about the UK as well and some of the richer countries. And I'm really excited that we get to go on a bit of a journey with this mini-series and explore in a bit more depth some different aspects of this ecosystems. And as Dan mentioned earlier, hopefully that then gives us the opportunity to start pointing towards how those ecosystems, economic ecosystems, can be improved and strengthened and deliver housing at the scale that's required. All right, Favour, let's hand over to you to close off the episode.
Yes, thank you very much, Richard. And allow me to say thank you again to Ian Shapiro for coming on our podcast and giving such valuable insights. We're really cheering for Real, and we hope that they get the support they need to scale up this wonderful work they are doing. And of course, I have to say a shout out to Dan. It's been really amazing co-hosting this podcast with you, and I look forward to all the episodes that we will co-host together. And of course, our dear listeners, thank you very much. We are continuing on this mini series, and it's only going to get better from here. Once again, you can continue to connect with us by checking us out on our social media pages at Flywheel Economics. But until next time, this has been the Flywheel Economics podcast.